This is Lung Cancer Voices of Hope. I'm Ann Stegall, a thoracic oncology nurse, and I lead patient services and healthcare delivery at the Longevity Foundation.
And I'm Dr. Misty Shields, a thoracic medical oncologist and physician scientist at Indiana University School of Medicine. Today on the show, we'll be discussing how to get the most out of your healthcare visits. We have two lovely guests today, an oncology nurse practitioner, Rasheda Persinger. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And lung cancer survivor, Bill Morris. Happy to have you here, Bill.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for being here on our show, and let's get started.
Bill, I want to invite you to share your survivor story as it relates to talking about your healthcare and your relationship with your own providers.
Well, I have a fantastic relationship with my oncologist. I actually really enjoy my oncologist a lot. There's a lot of she's done over the course of my treatment to just make me totally believe in her. And I think there's two things that every patient has to have with their oncologist. Number one is trust in the oncologist. And number two, it helps if you like them. And I say that because if you have advanced cancer, they're going to be in your life for quite a while, maybe for the rest of your life. So it really helps if you get along. And I'm very fortunate that my oncologist and I have a lot of similar interests in faith and in other things, and that just helps a lot. But it also feeds into the trust I have in her as well. So I was first diagnosed in 2021 and diagnosed as stage 3B. It took me almost a year to get diagnosed. I was having a hard time breathing, and they sent me to a allergist first, who didn't find anything wrong, and then I went to a pulmonologist that said I had great strength in my lungs, and finally my PCP said, "Look, I'm just going to send you for an MRI," and sure enough, there were two tumors on either side of the windpipe, sort of pushing it shut, and that's why I was having a hard time breathing. I was referred to Tennessee Oncology, and I researched the oncologists there, which I recommend everybody does. And I ended up with an oncologist who has a deep background in lung cancer research. And she and I just hit it off immediately. And I'll tell you something she did along the way that made a huge difference in trust. At one point, I had to have a biopsy. And the surgeon called me back that night and said, "I'm sorry, Bill, you're still full of cancer. It's all over the place." And my oncologist said, "I'll eat my hat if you still have cancer. I don't think you do." And so she had me go in for another biopsy, and the surgeon called me that night and said, "I'm so sorry, we were wrong. I've looked at your tumors from every angle. You no longer have active cancer." She said apparently the pathologist had just looked at my chart, saw that I had cancer, and said, "Nope, still full of it." But they were dead tumors. But that's, to me, that's a mark of a great oncologist who really fights for her patient and follows her own instinct. And that was great news for me.
You know, Bill, I'm wondering if there are any things that you wish you had known when you were first diagnosed. Are there questions that you wish you had known to ask in those early appointments?
Absolutely. I think there's two things. And the first is, I wish I had recorded the first appointment, because my wife and I both went to it. And as soon as you hear, "I'm sorry, you have cancer," everything else just kind of blanks out, and you don't pay very good attention to what they're saying after that. Neither my wife or I took very good notes. So I wish I had recorded that first session. That's number one. By the way, I do a Zoom meeting with cancer survivors every week, and I've pretty much hear that universally that they did not take good notes at their first diagnosis meeting, because they were just, their head was swimming with, "I have cancer." So I certainly wish I would have recorded it. I think the other thing that I didn't know at the time was to ask about biomarker testing. And I think somebody who's new to cancer certainly doesn't know to ask about biomarker testing. but it ends up being so important to your treatment regimen down the road and your options for clinical trials and everything else. So I wish I'd have known to ask about biomarkers.
Were you ever intimidated by those appointments? Did you ever feel like you were taking too much of your healthcare team's time, or that you just couldn't ask the questions that you really wanted to ask?
I think sometimes, yes. I think sometimes the questions you want to ask may seem really personal and a little bit off base. I think when you're a patient, a cancer patient, you start worrying that everything that happens to you physically may somehow be related to the cancer. And yet you're embarrassed to ask the oncologist because you know their time is precious. You know that they have to keep moving and get on to the next patients. But you just want to ask about, hey, the skin on my hand started peeling. Could that be related to the cancer? Whatever it is. And sometimes, yeah, out of embarrassment or because you're sensitive to their time constraints, you don't always ask the things that maybe you should.
Did you prepare for your appointments by writing down questions, or did your wife, write questions down so that when you came into the room, you had a list in front of you? And did you ever think to yourself, I'm not going to leave this appointment until I have all my questions answered?
You bring up a good point. At every one of those appointments, you should have somebody else with you in hopes that maybe they'll write things down better than you. We were a very unique situation because my wife, Lori, had a brain tumor the size of an orange at the same time that I was going through cancer treatments. So honestly, she wasn't able to help me very much at all. In fact, I think she went to two of my appointments just because she couldn't. She was going through her own huge medical challenges at the time. So now I would be a huge advocate for having somebody else in there taking notes for you, because I can almost promise you at every visit, the oncologist is going to say something that your brain is going to focus on, latch on to, not let go of, and you're going to miss a lot of what's said.
Did you ever feel like you didn't get what you needed from an appointment? Did you ever get to the car and say, oh, I wish I had asked that, or I felt like I needed to ask that, but I just wasn't able to?
I never felt like I was unable to ask something. She would stay in that room with me as long as I had questions. I just really wasn't very good for the questions. It was always on the ride home that I thought of the perfect question to ask her. So again, that's why if you have somebody else in the room with you, or you prepare for the meetings a little better than I did, and sometimes you just don't feel that well, and just going to the appointment takes everything out of you. So preparing for them in terms of writing down the questions and studying and doing things like that. There's sometimes during this walk with cancer, you just don't get to do those kinds of things.
Did you ever record your appointments?
I started to later on. I started to record them with her permission, and she was happy to give that permission too. And I found out most doctors are actually happy if you want to record a session with them. So I started towards the end. I wish I'd started in the beginning.
Rasheda, I know that some of what Bill has said probably resonates with you.
Yes, it does very much so. I was taking notes at the same time and checking things off that I have, on some of the things that I would love to hopefully address as well from a clinician standpoint in terms of when patients come in and what I have learned and been blessed to learn from those patients that I have been able to walk on this journey with them. So, yes, a lot of things resonated with me.
And Rasheda, have there ever been times where you just wish a patient would bring something up, or they might hesitate to bring something up? Can you think of an example to tell us and how that might be helpful to a patient's case?
Absolutely. I think one of the things when we think about what patients probably want to ask, but not for sure of, or don't want to come across using Bill's language or word, that maybe that's not educated question and so forth. I remember this one patient when I was doing a session with them in terms of the chemotherapy teach, right? So for all new patients, my physician partner would see the patients initially, then they would see me for that first visit where we would incorporate the chemotherapy education as well. And it would be a separate visit versus when their treatment would start, right? And so when I came in the room, I could tell the patient was nervous. I could sense it in the room. And I just said, you know what? They didn't have anybody with them. I agree with what Bill said. It's so good to be able to bring somebody with you. But let's be honest, everybody doesn't have that opportunity, whether someone's working or they just don't have that person that could come and be that recorder. So I said to the individual, I said, why don't you just record me? She was like, oh my gosh, you don't mind? Are you sure? I was like, absolutely, record it. Because I guarantee you, when whatever I'm saying is probably going in one ear and coming right out the other one. And she was you could just see that anxiety that she had of how in the world was she going to gather all this information and be able to walk out of here and know what to do had just kind of subsided, right? I had already opened up that door and made the space open. So therefore, she did have the opportunity to learn. And then on top of that, I said to her, I said, look, even with recording, you're going to go home, you're going to listen to some of these things, and you're going to say, that doesn't make any sense to me. I said, but here's my information. You can send me a chart message. That probably be the best way to get in contact with me. I said, ask whatever question. I said, because what I want to ensure to the best of my ability is that when you start that treatment, you have every tool in place that would make you successful for your treatment. So yes, I think that's one of the questions. I also think, when I would go through my chemotherapy teach, I would touch on intimacy because I think sometimes we get so focused on the cancer itself and the treatment. And don't get me wrong, there are some patients that is their focus. They could care less about the other variables at that moment until they go through that journey, right? But I bring that up not in a way to embarrass patients, but I want to establish a relationship that they feel they can come to me about anything. And whether if I don't know what I'm talking about or don't have any idea, I'm going to do my best to put them in the right direction. So yes, I have had those instances where I could tell that there are some things that I know patients want to ask, and they just bluntly told me after the fact, like, thank you so much, Rasheda. You really opened it up for us.
Well, I certainly applaud you for asking the intimacy question or addressing the intimacy question up front because, that's one of the ones that's really hard for patients when intimacy gets affected by this. It's kind of hard to bring it up with your oncologist because you're like, well, they're my oncologist, right? That's not really their specialty, but you don't know what to expect if somebody doesn't address it up front, that there may be intimacy issues. And then when you have them, it's like, okay, now what? Who do I talk to? Where do I go about it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rasheda, you bring up a really important point here, which is that patients need materials and information differently, right? And so as a provider, as we're seeing patients in clinic, what are different ways that you can discuss information with patients, whether that's materials, written handouts, walking them through? What does a typical clinic look like for you if you have a new patient in front of you? What materials or different avenues can you relay information through in that first visit?
That's a great question because it speaks to the individualization of patients and not doing this blanket approach that every patient learns this way, right? And so one of the things that one, want to make sure and not assume that English is their primary language, right? And what language is comfortable for them. Now, I only speak English, but I make every effort, or I would make every effort to make sure that I need to get a language line. I would even go as far as using Google language translation to make sure that the calendar that I provided for them in terms of how they take their pre-meds, what they need to make me aware about was in their language. So that's one thing is language. What is their primary language? Can they read? We make this assumption that patients can read, and it makes it uncomfortable for the patient to acknowledge that they cannot, right? I remember a patient that was not able to read, And English was not his first language, right? So I had to make sure that we got on a translator line. We made sure that he understood it and he could repeat it back to me. And then, in addition to that, he did have a sister that he would call on the phone during the follow up, and I would verbalize it to her. She gave me her email. I sent her the calendar in their language to make sure that all avenues, again, to the best of my ability, was addressed. So, therefore, when that patient walked out of there, that there was some sense of understanding. Because you know what I used to hate in clinic or hate amongst clinicians in the healthcare system? When we say that patients were not, what's the word we used to use, where they seemingly did not apply or did not go with what the program was or what the instructions were, yet we did not confirm that they actually understood what we were saying, or maybe they had a lot of anxiety going on, that this just wasn't the time to do that. In another example, I remember a patient that did come in overwhelmed to the umph level, right? And there was no way that I was going to get through a chemotherapy teach with them that day. And I made the executive decision to let her know, we're going to take this part today. If it's okay with you, we can do a Zoom meeting tomorrow. And then if it's okay with you, we'll follow up on the following day or next week. So therefore, we can digest this again. Because I don't think you can hold people accountable unless you do your due diligence to ensure that they understand what you're saying.
And don't you think that we should have learned that by the number of times that we hear patients say, nobody told me that, but you and I as nurses know that we did tell the patient, but that just is validation of what you're saying.
Exactly.
We really can't hold people accountable when we did not measure how much they actually were able to absorb.
And the word I was thinking of was non-compliant.
Compliant.
I hate that word. I hate that word.
And there's high anxiety or scanxiety if you're going in for scans before you see your doctor. And it's a real thing. And even if you've been in the cancer walk for years, right? 5 years, when it's time for you to do that 3-month scan or 6-month scan, you're still going to get scanxiety. I mean, I don't care how many times you've done it. And sometimes that high anxiety really impacts what you hear and what you don't hear in the doctor's office. I've noticed when I go into the doctor's to get results of a scan, I always have high blood pressure. I don't ever have high blood pressure any other time, but I always have it when I go in for those results. And I think that's just an indicator that I'm probably not going to listen as well as I probably should either.
So, Dr. Shields, if you don't mind, there's one more thing I have to say. I think, this really resonated me truly when I was in partnership with my last physician and partner, Dr. Benjamin Levy out of Hopkins. And I remember the first time when we were working together, he was getting to know me, I was getting to know how his style was. And he said to this new patient, this is a shared decision making. Okay. This is an opportunity where my responsibility is to discuss with you everything that I know from my teaching, my learning, what the evidence says. But this is a shared decision making, right? And then it also, from that resonated with me to take it or extrapolate it to how I dealt with patients in terms of this patient that is in front of me. Yes, they're here for it because they have an oncology diagnosis, but you don't know their journey. You heard Bill say the delay of what they thought it was to get him to where he got to. You don't know what trauma that family may have had as it relates to the healthcare system. You don't know any of that. And you don't even know the day to day, whatever it took for them to get there. And so I would love for us as clinicians, from the oncologist to the AP to the front desk to the nurse navigator to the infusion center, I wish that we could just for a moment take off our lens and be open to see the lens of how this patient presents to us, right? Because it's not just this patient coming into this appointment. We don't know what their journey was to get to that point. And so maybe showing a little bit more empathy in a patient that may ask you the same questions 50 times and you like, oh my gosh, do they not understand this? Maybe say they have so much on their mind. They just had they had to find parking in the parking garage to get here to this appointment. Now they're 15 minutes late. And now we have the nerve to kind of look at them like, you're late. So I say all that to say is that all of that has to be taken in when that patient sits in front of us, and either you're the oncologist going over results and you're telling them what the plan is, or you're the AP that is here to follow up, do symptom management, help them with all other things. So I really take that into perspective when I see patients.
And that's such a beautiful viewpoint, Rasheda, that we all can use a little bit of grace, right? And that we all are human. And so as providers, really seeing patients not as a chart, not as a number, not as a scan, but as patients are who they really are. And I think that's a call to action for all of us to really see patients and put ourselves in their shoes to see what they might be going through and making sure that every part of that patient and that patient's family is cared for.
Absolutely.
I'd love to pivot a little bit here and think about, if a patient wants to get a second opinion, what does that look like? Are we offended as providers for patients bringing that up? And how should a patient kind of go about getting a second opinion?
So I have to use my own experience, right? In working with excellent physician partners over the years, where second opinions is welcoming, where we see second opinions mostly are those patients who are newly diagnosed or early. They're very young and they have this rare cancer diagnosis, or they're young and have a common cancer that's not explainable, or there's a clinical trial, right? So you want to get a second opinion to make sure that this is the best option for you. I think many people, if you've heard me before, I am always on the fence. I really don't care if a provider is feeling some type of way about a second opinion. I really want patients to understand that that's your right. And again, it's not that you don't feel like the oncologist in front of you is great. They understand you've done your research. They're top notch. They understand this disease process. It's nothing to speak to that. But it's also, this is a major decision. This is a major step. This is a major journey. And so I feel like from clinicians, from the oncologists that I have worked with, they have always welcomed that, to the extent where they have also assisted with, making suggestions of who they may want to get a second opinion for. I don't feel that any oncologists that I have worked with have been intimidated, or try to belittle the patient or say that that's not necessary in terms of needing a second opinion. So my lens may be a little bit different than maybe others. But in my experience, second opinions have been something that has been expected and has not been looked upon, and definitely how to facilitate this. Now, what you may hear in that visit with your oncologist, and you all are talking about second opinion, especially in some cases, first thing that comes to my mind is like small cell lung cancer, something that we know rapidly grows very quickly. The physician may have, expressed that, the origin of the cancer, how the cancer disease process goes, and the possibility that there could be more symptomatic if we wait too late to get a second opinion. But I have not seen or experienced any of the physician partners that I have worked with that had become a problem.
My oncologist hit that head on, the second opinion issue head on early on, when she told me that, you're always going to get second opinions here anyway, because almost everything we do goes to a cancer board, right? Or
Yep.
so you're going to have several physicians looking at every step we're taking, right? Radiologists and surgeons. She told me at the first board meeting, the surgeon said, "Nope, can't do surgery on that. I mean, it's at the lymph nodes in his chest." So she said, if your oncologist is part of a team, you're almost always getting second opinions. But she said, if you ever want another one, go ahead and get one. I was very fortunate. I have a very good friend who works at a large pharmaceutical company in Seattle, Washington. And she had, when I was first diagnosed, she had their chief oncologist call me and
Mm.
talk to me about my diagnosis and what was in the report. And about 30 minutes into that conversation, he says, "Hey, who's your oncologist?" And when I told him, he goes, "Oh, shoot, Bill, if my kids had cancer, had your cancer, that's who I'd send them to. So you're golden."
Mhm.
So I had all the second opinion I ever needed.
Don't you also think that it's, I used to tell patients all the time, it's your peace of mind.
Yeah.
Like, even if you hear the exact same thing at another opinion, then you have peace of mind. If you get two completely different opinions, then get a third. Because I always felt like it was really important for patients to be on board with the plan. And if you have any second guessing of your team or your plan, then that's going to sit in your mind from then on. So
Absolutely.
you said it beautifully, Bill, in that, when you felt you were golden, you were ready to go, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Mhm.
I think there's one time that every patient should get a second opinion. And that is when your oncologist says, "There's nothing else we can do for you." At that point, if you're a patient, you better go get a second opinion and a third opinion, and just keep on getting opinions until you find. I work with somebody at Living with Faith in Cancer, whose oncologist said, "I don't have any more trials to put you on." And she ended up finding one herself on the internet, and she's on that trial right now. And it's a trial that has a 60% success rate. But the recommendation for her to go on that trial didn't come from her oncologist. It came from her research. And she didn't take, "We don't have anything else for you to try at this point."
Mhm.
She just didn't take that.
Yeah. I think that's a beauty thing. I think one of the things I will say before the other comment was that we cannot minimize the fact that patients are more savvy, that there are resources out there. There are different groups. There are different groups based off of target biomarkers, just in general. And they are sharing information, which I think is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. I also wanted to mention, as we talk about second opinions, I think it's also important for us to break down those barriers as it relates to academic versus community and so forth. And I think, again, using my own experience, I think it was a beautiful thing that within our practice, because we had made those relationships with community, quote unquote, oncology offices, we would give patients that their oncologists will refer to us for that second opinion. But Dr. Levy at no point would just harbor that patient. If the treatment plan was the same, or if we didn't have a clinical trial, he would say, "Yes, I would agree with what your oncologist is stating." And then he would have this conversation with that oncologist. And so I think that barrier of, or those myths, some true, that, when you go to the academics, just want the community patients, or there are not great oncologists in community practices. I think when we acknowledge that and we have that relationship built, you have this camaraderie where one is sharpening each other. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you, Rashida. And, I think it speaks to that we're stronger together as a community. And this is a very tight knit community. If I can't help someone, I want to reach out to my partners who might be in nearby institutions or even in other states to really try to help patients. And I think it really speaks to the altruism that is in medicine, and that we do want to help others. I think that's fundamentally, as we know, it's first do no harm, and really with patients and loved ones at the forefront to help them. Rashida, can you speak about a little bit about the timing in clinic? Right, we know that clinical practices are very busy. Emergencies always occur, right? There's unexpected turns, and some patients may need a little bit more time during their visit than we expect, or that was slotted for in a 20-minute visit or a 30-minute visit. How may patients or their loved ones kind of prioritize making sure they get what they want to talk about across to their team? What does that look like?
I think that's a great point, because let's be real. time in clinic is limited at times, and there are certain time blocks. But I also think in what we had instituted in practice and clinical practice, that there are patients that we know for whatever reason may need a little bit more time. And so we would ensure that when those patients went to check out, we would say maybe put them at the end part of the day, the later part of the day, or make sure that if we couldn't do the later part of the day and we knew that we needed to block 2 follow-up appointment times, right? Or maybe put them close to where I would normally go for lunch. So that appointment right before lunch. So just in case we go over, which we know we may do, then I've already allotted time for that. So therefore it wouldn't back up things. But we can do the best planning, Dr. Shields, you know this. And if an emergency comes up, it can potentially derail things. So I think initially upfront with patients is us being very transparent on how the process goes, what's the expectation from both parties, right? And how we can accommodate to the best of our ability to ensure that you get that time. When we speak about that, I think also you can't speak about that without saying that I really would encourage patients that before you come for that day's follow-up appointment, to think about what are the 3 top things that have maybe been bothering me or I have a question about since the last time I saw my clinician, my oncologist, or my APP. Put that down, write that down, put it in your phone. You can even ask Siri, these are the things that I want to bring up in my follow-up appointment, right? So therefore, when you get into that appointment with that clinician, you can already bring it up, right? I mean, if you're one of those savvy patients that has this nice journal book and you've kept up a day of every symptom, which is wonderful, I'm not dismissing. If you've kept up every symptom over the last month before you saw that, I would say go through those symptoms. See if you can prioritize those or group them into symptoms to ensure that when you get into that room, you have that. Again, likewise, if you are fortunate to have someone who comes with you, maybe share that information with them so therefore they can keep you on task so that your voice is heard, not theirs, but your voice is heard. And then also maybe if they can't come with you, but maybe you can call them in, then do that as well. Put them on the phone. So therefore you feel supported to keep you focused on what the goal that you want to walk away from this meeting with. So I would say, going back to your question, Dr. Shields, I say, ask if there's a possibility that you can maybe do a little bit more lengthy time. See if that oncologist has that capability. Could you do something closer to their lunchtime or maybe at the end of their day? Or maybe they say first thing in that morning time schedule. Talk to them. And then again, not just only putting the onus on the patients, because I'm pretty sure clinicians will hear this as well. Be transparent up front with patients. I find that patients are more understanding when we don't just throw something at them mid-journey and we've been upfront from the beginning throughout the journey.
Thank you, Rasheda, for really that key information here. And following up on that, many times, and we really do encourage this, that we have care partners join in the visit. I'd love to hear your thoughts and also then Bill's thoughts of how can care partners help support our patients and be encouraging, empowering, but sometimes, it's possible, might overstep. How do we find that right balance, and what does that look like?
I mean, that's a great question. And do we always get it right? No. But I think care partners, when we think about it, their purpose is to make sure that our voice is being heard, right? So in that sense, they are there to help with, like I said, sharing information to make sure we are on the same page when we get in there with the clinician. 2, maybe they have a list of items that you all spoke about prior to coming in, helping with transportation, helping maybe picking up prescription, helping maybe arranging care at home. I think care partners is not only helping them when they're in with the oncologist, but they can also serve as a source outside of that visit, outside if they're on infusion treatments. There's other tasks that a care partner can do. And I think, again, I'm a proponent of making sure we set these guidelines up front. So what I usually ask, or what I have asked in the past, is that, is it okay with you if I ask your care partner, is there something that he or she may have noticed that you may have overlooked in this discussion? And if that patient is okay with that, then I will turn my question to that. But I think that one shows respect to the patient, because it's the patient who is living this experience. Though care partners are too, and caregivers are too, to a certain extent, it is the patient that is walking through this actual treatment. So I think that gives respect to them. You've acknowledged their feelings. You're not overstepping your boundaries as well. And you give them an opportunity to say yes or no. And I will tell you, I have not always gotten yes. That has not always been yes. Some have said, no, I don't want you to do that, but I have to respect that.
I think that sometimes caregivers have a lot smarter questions than the patients do. And I've noticed something for people who've been walking with cancer for a while. Early on, it seems like the stress is on the patient, right? They're the ones dealing with
Hmm.
potentially the
Hmm.
mortality and all of that. At some point, there's a transition where the patient comes to grips with what's going on, and it's the caregiver who is carrying the anxiety that never seems to really go away for them, right? Because
Hmm.
oftentimes the caregiver is your spouse or parent or child, and they're so scared that they're going to be left without you. And so while the patient moves on, sometimes the caregiver has a harder time doing it. And so I think, to the extent that you can offer more services that service providers can offer more services to caregivers, especially emotional or spiritual services, I think that would be a great thing. As far as the services that they offer to patients, I think pulling in palliative care early
Hmm.
into it.
Hmm.
I've talked to a lot of other cancer survivors who never get told about palliative care by their oncology team, and that's kind of a shame, because they are going through other things, right? They've developed side effects, autoimmune disorders from immunotherapy or something like that. That's better handled by a palliative care team than it is by your oncologist team. So I think pulling in palliative care earlier in the whole patient oncology team relationship may be a good idea.
Bill, I couldn't agree with you more. When I used to do my chemotherapy teach, that was on day one, that was mentioned, because I find that if you don't introduce palliative up front, and then you try to introduce it later on when maybe things are not going as well, treatment wise or curative wise, you get this different approach, right? And if we
Yeah, they
introduce
think
that.
you're sending them to hospice.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. And so then palliative gets this, bad rap. Yes, palliative can be utilized in hospice, but palliative in its definition is necessary even early on to mediate those symptoms that we are having. So I love that you brought that up, because I think that's something that we all need a reminder of. That should be from day one.
Well, as we are about to wind down this episode, I want to ask you, Bill, from thinking back from those early days and the relationship that you have with your provider, what's one thing that really helped you to feel empowered to be your own advocate in your lung cancer experience?
Well, I think being a member of Longevity and doing the Tuesday meetings has been so empowering for me and for so many other people who are members of that organization, because it's made us so much smarter, right? We're a lot more informed when we go in and meet with our oncology team. I'm the one that brought up biomarker testing to my team. They hadn't brought it up to me. I brought it up to them because I'd been on the Tuesday longevity calls before and realized, well, shoot, I don't know what my biomarkers are. So I went in and asked about it. And she said, I don't know, let's pull your original biopsy and see what they are. So I just think the more you get involved in the cancer support communities, the better it makes you at communicating with your provider team. And I think that helps a lot. When you first go into this, you don't know the difference between broad-based radiation and SBRT and everything else. Those are things you learn along the way. The more that the oncology team can explain all that up front, I think the more it would help. But yeah, I just think being in a support organization like Longevity, and it was my oncology team that told me about Longevity, and I'm sure glad they did. And I hope that all oncologists do something like that for patients. It helps a lot.
Thank you so much, Bill. We appreciate that. And Rasheda, we've come a long way in treating lung cancer. So I'm just wondering if you could pick one thing. What do you feel like has impacted your hope for lung cancer patients the most?
I think just the treatment options. Every time I am asked a question to this, I get a little choked up, right? Because I've been in oncology for over 20 years, and so I remember the early days of my career when I saw lung cancer patients. So it impacts me because those patients that were unfortunate to pass away, knowing now all of the amazing advancements that are in lung cancer, knowing now that we have a 5-year survival, even with, I remember when the PDL1 update came out, I think 3 years ago at ASCO, and there was a 5-year survival for a patient with metastatic lung cancer.
Yeah.
And then when we think about outfusions and EGFR, and the list just grows on and on and on, it just warms my heart. Not just as a clinician, but as a human being, to know that the diagnosis of a patient with lung cancer is not necessarily a death sentence as we thought 20 years ago. And the options that are out there is just keeps on growing. And people like Dr. Shields and her colleagues who are doing the scientific work to find out new ways and new things to treat for this population, that's what motivates me. And that's what keeps me hoping. That's what keeps me just excited if a person has to get this diagnosis or it lands on their laps, that there is hope. And so that's very impactful to me. It's the research, the treatments, the different options, seeing patient as an individual, not just a one treatment fits all.
Christy at Longevity likes to say, no one wants to get cancer, but now's a great time to do it because there are a lot of options. It gives hope to people who are newly diagnosed. It gives hope to meet people who are 5-year survivors, 15-year survivors. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Hope Summit is you meet all of those survivors. I have the pins from year 1 survivor through year 5 survivor, because I'm a 5-year survivor now. Then 3 years active cancer free after being on an immunotherapy trial that failed. So you just never know. You just got to keep moving forward, taking a look at options, and you never know. And I'm happy to be 3 years cancer free now, and I feel fantastic.
Yeah. Congratulations, Bill.
Thank you.
I'm telling you, you've warmed my heart.
Yeah, I agree with all that you have said, and I think that it's a great way to wrap up this episode in talking about hope and knowing that a metastatic disease diagnosis is not what it once was, and that it is important to have this relationship with your healthcare team, because you could be with this team, as Bill said, for a long time. So establishing that relationship, having that mutual respect for each other is just really important. So I want to thank all of our listeners today for listening to this episode of Lung Cancer Voices of Hope. I hope that you all have learned something to take home with you and that you can use what you've heard today to get the most out of your next appointment with your healthcare team. Please feel free to join us on our Longevity website at longevity.org. Bill also mentioned our Tuesday meetups, which are a wonderful support. We have lots of resources like our gateways. We have some places that will help you have conversations with your healthcare team about biomarkers, or just simply a list of questions that are things that you might want to ask your team. So please just know that you are not alone. There is hope. And here at Longevity, we are happy to help you in any way that we can.
If you found this information on the show helpful, please be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app and leave a review so others know to listen. I'm Dr. Misty Shields here with Ann Stegall, and we thank you for listening.